Hi, my name is Clark Macbeth. You may know me as somebody that works retail in Maple Grove, which is also the city that I live in. Maple Grove is a suburb of Minneapolis. So, this is my YouTube channel. I do this as a hobby, and this channel is about Minnesota. It is about the goings on within Minnesota and what you need to know about Minnesota. Minnesota, Minnesota, Minnesota. I cannot emphasize that enough. As a YouTube channel that covers Minnesota, I cannot completely avoid controversial topics. So in this video and in all the videos going forward, I will be having 3 ground rules whenever I discuss controversial topics. The first ground rule is that the statements I make are observational. Either I have personally observed what I have stated, or I have done research, and there will be citations, and this research will often have data, or it will be from a reliable source. And the third ground rule is that if there is a fact, I will not be disputing it. If it is 100% certain fact, that means the people disputing that fact are spreading falsehoods. I will not be wasting my breath spreading false information. That is bad journalism. It is also an unethical way to make YouTube views, and I personally will not be doing that. Today, I will be discussing the topic of public transportation in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. The public transportation in Minneapolis and St. Paul is actually quite good. You can go just about anywhere on bike, and if you don't want to ride your bike all the way, you can easily mount your bike on the light rail or the bus, and that will take you pretty much anywhere you need to go within the cities themselves. Even if you are not a cyclist, the public transportation infrastructure within Minneapolis and St. Paul is very sophisticated. You can take the light rail or bus just about anywhere you need to go. It will take longer than driving, but that infrastructure is very much there. I will dare say that the public transportation infrastructure within Minneapolis and St. Paul is the best in the Midwest if you leave out Illinois. And a lot of things in Minneapolis are the best in the Midwest if you leave out Illinois. In fact, the Metro Transit was once rated the system of the year, but since then, there have been issues that have prevented that from happening again. I will not be discussing that in this video. I do not have the time to do that, but I will be discussing the expansion of the system. But even discussing the expansion of the system will take multiple videos. I have decided to cover the expansion of the light rail because it is the most ambitious project. The expansion of the Green Line is already underway, it is under construction, and the funding for the expansion of the Blue Line has already been allocated. But there are some hurdles to the expansion of the Blue Line. While the Green Line expansion and the Blue Line expansion are recent developments, and Metro Transit as we know it is a system that is relatively new. The historical context of public transportation in Minneapolis, St. Paul is that warrants its own video, but since this video is about public transportation, I will be giving you the Cliffs Notes version of the history of public transportation in Minneapolis, St. Paul, just to bring things into context. In the 1860s, there were attempts to build a public transportation system with streetcars, but they didn't really go much of anywhere. In 1875, some dude named Thomas Lowry, who was a real estate mogul, thought it would be a good idea to build streetcars in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and he worked with the city to establish what became known as Twin Cities lines. Thomas Lowry, somewhat ironically, has a tunnel for automobiles named after him. The streetcar system of Twin Cities lines was more sophisticated than the current Metro Transit system is today. There were a lot of streetcars going a lot of places. Here is a map of that. So Twin Cities lines initially started as a horse and buggy thing. Then in the 1890s, it became electrified, and there were streetcars everywhere, just like just about any other city in the United States. What made Twin Cities lines unique was that the streetcars themselves were huge in comparison to the streetcars of other cities. The system was sophisticated, and it ran smoothly for most of its history. There are 3 exceptions to that, the third of which is the end. But first, let's cover the first 2. During World War I, there was a very massive labor dispute for the workers running Twin Cities lines, and eventually the government had to step in to end that. The second major disruption to Twin Cities lines was when the streetcars went from 2-person operation to 1-person operation. They essentially cut their workforce in half, and the people that were left running Twin Cities lines had crazy schedules that were not unlike working part-time in retail. Then there is the end of Twin Cities lines. In other urban areas, these streetcars were dismantled by a company known as National City Lines. They took over the public transport infrastructure, and then they dismantled it because it was a conspiracy by General Motors, Firestone, tire companies, people that wanted to sell cars. That happened elsewhere in the United States, but in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, our system was sabotaged by one person, and that person was named Charles Green. He bought some shares in Twin Cities lines, and at the time, the people managing Twin Cities lines did not give dividends. What they did was they used the profit to mostly expand the system and maintain it. Charles Green wanted his dividends, so he purchased even more shares and kicked out the management of Twin Cities lines in the late 1940s. From then on, the streetcars became dismantled, and Twin Cities lines started becoming a bus-only operation. And while Wall Street speculation certainly did not do riders of Twin Cities lines any favors, the real nail in the coffin came from the construction of the interstate highway system in Minnesota. You have Interstate 94 going along Minneapolis-St. Paul from east to west. And you also have the trunk highways along Interstate 94 that go in all sorts of directions. And then you have Interstate 35 that goes through Minneapolis and St. Paul in the north and south direction. The thing about Interstate 35 was they had to split that highway in half so that Minneapolis and St. Paul could get a piece of that commerce. So that is why you will see Interstate 35E and Interstate 35W. These are the only interstate highways with letters in them, except for Hawaii, which they really should call that an intrastate. It is worth pointing out that in parts of Minnesota, 94 west and east, they primarily go in the direction of north to south. Interstate 94 in general is an east to west interstate, but they put a kink in that. That kink is what can get people easily from St. Cloud to Minneapolis and back. There is, however, a massive problem with the way the interstate highway system in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and all of the major freeways are built. In Minneapolis, St. Paul, the highways are prone to traffic congestion, which also causes more air pollution. The highway system in Minneapolis, St. Paul was built rather poorly, and there are some patchwork fixes to that. One of the most notable things you will see here is during rush hour, there is only one car allowed on the ramp per green. These metered ramps help a little bit, and they prevent collisions. But when it comes to these highways, that and the HOV lanes are really the only fixes that can be made on the roads themselves. Minneapolis, St. Paul made its bed in the way and the shape that the freeways have been built, and now we have to lie in it. In Minneapolis, St. Paul, the roads are built like a grid, so you have to more frequently get on and off highways to get to a specific place. And during rush hour, that means having to deal with more metered ramps. There is some construction of ring roads, but it's too little too late. They can't take the major highways and turn them all into ring roads. That would be prohibitively expensive. Kansas City is primarily ring roads, so there aren't that many ramps you have to go on and off to get to where you need to go in the Kansas City metropolitan area. You're basically going one direction or another in the big circle, which covers the suburbs. You also have the inner circle, which is known as the downtown freeway loop. In Kansas City, there is no naturally occurring traffic congestion. Even during rush hour, you can get to where you need to go very quickly. The only exceptions to this are when there is road construction or when they are picking up the mess after a collision. That's Kansas City. Now back to Minnesota. So with the interstate highways built and people using them and driving, Twin Cities lines could not maintain a profit of any kind. So in the early 1970s in Minnesota, the public transportation infrastructure, what little was left of it, was taken over by the government. From that point on, it became a government function. This brings us to Metro Transit. From the 1970s until the late 1990s, there was just this dead period in Minnesota where public transportation infrastructure was practically non-existent. What happened since then became the metro transit system that we know of today. In 1999, the Minnesota legislature allocated funding to building the Blue Line, or as it was originally called, the Hiawatha Line. In 2004, the Hiawatha Line was opened to much fanfare at the time. 2004 officially kicked off the rebirth of public transportation in Minneapolis and later St. Paul. The Hiawatha Line initially did not go very far, but soon after it was built, it was expanded to the termini that are currently in place today. The northern terminus being Target Field, and the southern terminus being the Mall of America. The Metro Blue Line currently will take you from Target Field to US Bank Stadium to, the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, which is also the train that connects Terminals 1 and 2, and the Metro Blue Line will take you to the Mall of America. 10 years later, the Green Line was opened. That is the light rail system that connects Minneapolis to St. Paul. The Green Line is also the one that goes to the U of M. The Metro Green Line does have a couple of faults that I feel the need to address. One of which is that there may be too many stops in the current iteration of the Green Line, which means if you are taking a long stretch of the Green Line, it is going to take you longer to get there, especially in comparison to the Blue Line. This can be remedied with an express service. They do this in Chicago with the L trains all the time. If that is really a big deal, they will start doing that. Then there is the criticism that it doesn't go directly to the Xcel Energy Center. Civil engineers will tell you that it wouldn't be realistic to add a kink to the Green Line to directly get you to your Minnesota Wild game. It just wouldn't be realistic. But the Green Line can help you in that it will get you to a bus that will take you to Xcel Energy Center. It will get you closer to Xcel Energy Center, and then you just have to take a bus the rest of the way. That's not a problem. So that is a simplified history of the Green and Blue Line to this very day, as of the posting of this video. Then there are the expansion projects. Up until this point, the Metro Blue Line and the Metro Green Line did not venture very far from the Minneapolis-St. Paul cities themselves. The Metro Blue Line goes into Bloomington, which is a suburb right next to the Twin Cities and the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. And then there is the Green Line, which also does not venture very far from St. Paul. That's about to change. The Green and Blue Lines were once city systems for the cities. Now they're expanding out into the metro. As I said earlier, the Green Line expansion is already under construction. The Metro Green Line expansion is going to go through the southwest suburbs of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. It was once called the Southwest Light Rail Project. And there is some controversy with this line. Before I get into the controversial stuff, there is a fact that needs to be pointed out. The southwest region of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area is stagnating economically. Seriously, when is the last time you heard about an exciting thing happening in Minnetonka? When it comes to hosting events, the southwest region of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area is not as desirable as the very south metro, which includes Apple Valley, and the very north metro, which includes Maple Grove, Rogers, and Elk River. The people in the southwest suburbs who support the Southwest Green Line expansion are hoping that the Green Line will change that. Then there are the opponents. The opponents of the Green Line expansion, they lost. It's a done deal. The Green Line expansion is going to happen. But the people who oppose it are the people who oppose light rail projects in their community for general reasons. The thing is, there are some wealthy Minnesotans in the southwest suburbs who will tell you that they are really concerned about what the Green Line will do to their property values. That can mean very different things. And let me be very blunt with you on the property values. The property along the Blue Line is some of the most highly valued property in Minneapolis. And the property along the Green Line is some of the most desirable property in St. Paul. That is going to continue to be the case with the expansion of the Green and Blue Line. While some have concerns about the aesthetic of light rail being in their area and that might lower their property values, a lot of people who say they are concerned about the property values are really saying they don't want more people who are unable to drive in their community. The people who are unable to drive, having access to the southwest suburbs, are more likely to have darker skin. In fact, there was a mayor who was along the Green Line expansion project who famously said that he was concerned it would bring more ethnics in his community. There are also Minnesotans in that area who really would not like to have the noise of having light rail in their backyard. Yes, there is a NIMBY aspect to this. I certainly would not want to have a metro light rail train next to my house. These things are really, really loud. They make this noise that I'm going to call the ship's bell that you can hear from a very long distance. They sometimes scream when they are coming to a halt, and they blow their horn for people who are either standing or driving in front of them when they are not supposed to. And they will also just toot their horns casually. These trains are loud. But if you get hit by a light rail train in Minnesota, it's your fault. Unless you're deaf, it's your fault. It's a Darwin Award for you. These trains are hard to miss because they're really, really loud. So, yeah, that's just the reality of light rail transit. The expansion of the Blue Line is nowhere near as controversial as the expansion of the Green Line, because a lot of that train would be along highways. This is especially true in Brooklyn Park, which would be the northern terminus of that. The Blue Line expansion would definitely be used by the people of Brooklyn Park. Despite the more enthusiastic support for the Blue Line expansion in the Northwest region, the projected ridership is nowhere near as high for the Blue Line expansion as it was for the Green Line expansion. That is one of the major hurdles to getting the Blue Line expansion constructed. Construction for the Blue Line has yet to begin. Support for the Blue Line expansion is very high, but Metro Transit has proposed an alternate route in which the Blue Line would have a stop in Maple Grove. That would make the Blue Line expansion a lot more controversial than it currently is. While there is more community support for the Blue Line expansion than there was with the Green Line expansion, there is one more obstacle to the Blue Line expansion that may not be overcome, that may send Metro Transit back to the drawing board.
No!
BNSF is claiming to be concerned about the safety of operating a light rail on its track. They claim to be concerned about a Blue Line train and a freight train doing the smashy. BNSF, which has been supportive of transit projects in the past, is not given its approval for this transit project. They are claiming to be smarter than civil engineers when it comes to building things. BNSF claims that to be a concern, though really they are concern trolling. The real issue is that if Blue Line trains have to share track with BNSF freight trains, moving freight will become more difficult for BNSF. That is the real issue. I really wish that BNSF were more honest about that. Right now, we are at a point where the Metro Transit is still trying to negotiate with BNSF to get BNSF's approval. In all likelihood, that isn't going to happen. There is no evidence that BNSF is going to budge and let the Blue Line trains on its track. Let's assume that Metro Transit is sent back to the drawing board. The federal funding for the Blue Line expansion is contingent on BNSF approving a portion of its track for Blue Line trains. That probably isn't going to happen. So if Metro Transit is sent back to the drawing board, the thing is, when projects like this are hyped up and there are government agencies saying this is a thing that is probably going to happen, and they are faced with hurdles such as this, they are going to try and find a way to make it happen in some way. In all likelihood, the Blue Line expansion project will not be canceled outright, but Metro Transit will try to find alternatives. The lack of federal funding will leave Metro Transit with a funding gap. There are a few ways to fill this gap, at least in part. If the nature of the Blue Line is altered, there is still a possibility that the Blue Line expansion will happen, but it won't entirely be made of trains. 2020 is an election year, and Metro Transit may be holding out hope that there will be a more transit-friendly Minnesota legislature following that election. They may be waiting for that and hoping that will fill the gap. But in all likelihood, the Blue Line expansion will really changed the definition of the Blue Line from something that is exclusively light rail to something that is more of a mix of light rail and bus rapid transit. That is a way to get something. That would be the most immediate fix. Of course, if the Metro Transit decides to go with bus rapid transit for parts of the Blue Line expansion, they can't really go back on that. They can't decide this is bus rapid transit and then go back and say, you know what, we can go back and make that light rail again. That's not really how transit expansions work. When the mode of transportation is decided, it is in almost all cases permanent. There was a proposal to bring light rail to the southern metro area, the Apple Valley region of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, but that was not proven to be cost effective, so the red line was it was built with bus rapid transit instead, and they're not going to suddenly make that a light rail project again. That's just not feasible. Regardless of what path the Metro Transit takes, the Blue Line expansion is almost certain to happen. There's just been so much time and effort put into planning it that there is going to be construction. There will be a Blue Line expansion, and if Maple Grove is a part of that expansion, there is another sticking point to that. If they, go with an alternate route that includes Maple Grove, the problem is that Maple Grove has its own transit system that they have their own commuter bus, so would people decide to take the Blue Line expansion instead of Maple Grove's commuter bus? Would commuters have to use the Maple Grove transit bus for commuting hours and the Blue Line expansion for other hours? I don't know. And we may never know, because it is more than likely that Maple Grove will not be included in the Blue Line expansion itself. So that's the meat of the transit expansion projects in Minneapolis-St. Paul, the two most ambitious ones anyway, but I should probably address the bones. The Metropolitan Council is the reason that these expansion projects are even possible. And the existence of the Metropolitan Council is somewhat controversial. The current governor has paid some lip service to reforming it, but that hasn't really happened. And how to reform it really depends on what side of the spectrum you're on. There are some people who say that the Metropolitan Council should not even exist. But with the cooperation of the city and the suburbs, more transit expansion projects have happened, and I will be covering more of those in later videos. Then there is the county's Transit Improvement Board. Some people on the left are somewhat bitter that this was abolished, but by abolishing the county's Transit Improvement Board, there was a huge pile of money left that helped fund more transit expansion projects. So that is why the Green Line expansion, the Blue Line expansion, and bus rapid transit projects within Minneapolis have not been at the mercy of the state legislature. The funding for a lot of things have already been allocated. So that is a summary of the Green Line expansion and Blue Line expansion projects. If you want to hear more about Minnesota. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to this channel. And I will see you in the next video.